Let's wait a few more seconds. I see people are still connecting.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good evening for those of you who are in Ukraine. Thank you for joining us for this online seminar of the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies. We hope everybody is safe at home, wherever home is, and we are happy you can join us for discussing Ukraine response to COVID-19. We have two great speakers directly from Ukraine here with us who will be able to give us news from Ukraine and also give us their analysis on the way the government is managing the situation. Let me briefly present them before giving them the floor. We will first have Volodymyr Dubovyk, who is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for International Studies at Odessa Mechnikov National University. Volodymyr has been working on Ukraine general foreign policy situation, transatlantic relations between Ukraine and the US, and Black Sea security. And our second speaker will be Ivan Gomza, who is Associate Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the Kiev School of Economics, and who is working more globally on democratization, authoritarian regimes, contentious politics, and good governance, as well as nationalism. So the two of them will have great feedback to give us on the situation in Ukraine and also give us some kind of critical analysis of what it means for Zelensky government to be facing such a crisis. So I will give them the floor, each of them for 15 minutes. First Volodymyr, then Ivan, and then I will monitor and moderate the discussion. I will ask everybody to ask your question in the Q&A box that you can see on the right of your screen. If you ask in this Q&A section, it will go to everybody. If you want to ask a question in a more discreet or anonymous way, you can just send it to me personally, but I invite everybody to ask questions in the Q&A during the presentation or after, and I will moderate the discussion in the second part of the event. So Volodymyr, can I give you the floor to begin?
Yes. Thank you, Marlene, for this introduction, and thank you to you personally and to the Institute of European, Russian, Eurasian Studies at George Washington University for hosting this event and for paying attention to this subject of various countries in the region, the post-Soviet region, in this case, Ukraine, struggling and facing this challenge of the COVID-19. I should say that Ukraine's response is pretty much a mixed picture. You have some positive features here, and you have some negative features as well. On the positive side, I should say that we have went into the lockdown, into quarantine early on, March 12th. So basically, it's in a week from now. It's going to be 2 months since we went into lockdown and quarantine here in Ukraine. It's actually one of the earliest lockdowns here in the region, at least, of the broader Eastern Europe. But we also, another thing which was done rightly by our leadership, authorities here in Ukraine, but the government, is that they have recognized from the get-go that this is a serious threat. This is something that needs to be dealt with in a systemic, serious way. So unlike some other countries where you have leaders who've been basically saying for weeks, if not months, that this is nothing special, this is just another seasonal flu, let's not spread the fear and so on, and therefore wasted a lot of time, actually, instead of trying to implement some measures to protect the population. Here in Ukraine, that wasn't the case, and that's a good thing. So basically, early lockdown, closing the borders, and then recognizing that this is a serious thing upon us. So, and we need to take some serious measures to fight it. Here, I'm afraid that basically the list of good things pretty much ends, except for perhaps the fact that we don't have too many cases. It's all relative, from country to country. We now have currently a little over 13,000 cases, 13,000 cases, and we've had a little over 300 deaths. And we are now at the last several days getting around 500 new cases of infection by COVID-19 daily. So it's kind of still growing. We are not yet to our peak, and we don't know clearly right now when this peak one might arrive and what would it manifest itself, how it will manifest itself. I mean, what numbers we would have by the time we'll get to the peak. I mean, it's still growing. I mean, unlike in many other countries in the region again, and maybe in some Western European countries, we haven't turned the corner yet. We haven't been over this peak moment of the epidemic. So it's hard to say what's going to happen. Right now, the quarantine is still on, the lockdown is still on, but you know, in Ukraine, the lockdown is not very strict. You know, a lot of people are defying it. A lot of people are not happy. A lot of people are not happy with a lockdown. They think that a lockdown basically lacks logic, reason behind it. And also, a lot of people still believe that this COVID-19 thing is nothing special, is nothing serious. So actually, the conspiracy theories here in Ukraine, maybe not entirely unlike in many other countries, are divided into subgroups. One subgroup is that people think the government is basically fear-mongering, there's nothing special going on, why are our shops and enterprises being closed? And another subgroup is actually on the contrary, they're saying the government is concealing the actual number of cases, is not doing enough to actually identify the actual number of cases, real number of cases. So there are two lines of thought here, schools of thought in terms of conspiracies here. Ukraine, of course, is not a rich country, so that doesn't help when you are up to the threat of this sort. Also, our medical system, our healthcare system is not very good. Let's put it mildly. It's very much in an appalling state. There's been an attempt to proceed with healthcare reform. In the previous years, under the previous president, there was this acting minister of health, Ulana Sukun, who was trying to push the healthcare reform hard. And she had a vision, but she didn't have a goal. She didn't have a goal. I mean, didn't have a chance to implement fully her vision, didn't have enough time. She was blocked here and there. She was, mocked. She was actively taken on by various people who were the lobbyists of big pharma business and other things. So she was basically prevented from proceeding with healthcare reform in a proper systemic way. Now that since she's gone, unfortunately, the healthcare reform is not there. And actually, in the last few days, maybe a couple of days here in Kyiv, we are hearing more news about basically healthcare reform in the way she saw it, and it made a lot of sense to many of us who observed her vision and supported her. That medical reform, that healthcare reform is kind of dead. So, of course, most clinics, most hospitals are not well equipped. Actually, those dealing with infection diseases in Ukraine are notoriously, unfortunately, the least equipped and the least comfortable. There are some clinics and hospitals that are more upscale, but they're not really treating coronavirus patients right now in Ukraine. And another problem, of course, that the medics are not well prepared. There are protocols how to treat it, how to deal with it, but still, some patients, COVID patients, came to the hospitals which were not specialized to deal with it, and that's how we get a lot of medics infected. Actually, out of a number that I've mentioned early on in my presentation, we have about 1/5, about around 20% of medics, people who are infected with coronavirus are medics. And that's a problem, of course, because you have to close down several big entire clinics here and there in hospitals. Like, for instance, here in the region of Odessa, there is a Podilsk, formerly known as Kotovsk, and there for a while the only hospital which was actually selected to be the one of the major points to fight coronavirus was closed down because they had a massive contamination of medics and a lot of infection around the medics, so they had to close it down entirely. And the National Guard is actually called to deal with the city. The city is now in more or less a strict lockdown. Another thing that I would like to mention that, of course, we still have a war ongoing, which complicates issues, budgetary, otherwise. The government has to choose priorities, and there's not enough money. It's never been enough money, but with the war ongoing, still, it's even less of the money in the budget for something like this, COVID-19. And then the economics is in a poor shape. Actually, we had a slowdown of economic output even before the COVID arrived. And that was a big problem, and a lot of people mentioned that. But now, of course, since we are almost in 2 months of lockdown and most enterprises are not working, that's even worse. And of course, like elsewhere, there is a lot of discussion about what's going to happen to the economy and how people are going to survive. And apparently, a big segment of population, having a big, serious problem with, having their ends meet. And that's a huge problem, and that's a dilemma for Ukrainian leaders as well. Right now, they are talking about prolonging lockdown, the quarantine, but at the same time, there will be some easing going on here and there. And that's how it is in many other countries. I mean, we don't, even as epidemics is not over yet, we still have to do something for our economy to give some fresh blood to it, to give some opportunity for the economy to move forward. So that's how it is with the economy, and that's, of course, a problem. And we rely a lot in this situation, frankly, on international support and assistance. There have been some money given by United States government, State Department for that purpose. There have been some money given by European Union. And then, of course, there is the International Monetary Fund. So that's an issue. And unfortunately, there are still some laws sitting in the parliament not being adopted properly for the IMF to disperse another portion of the money that Ukraine needs badly right now. So on political side, it's a challenge as well. It's a challenge for the government. It's a challenge for the president. The President Zelensky lost a lot of his rating even prior to the arrival of COVID-19. The ratings were going down, slowly but steadily. And he was nervous about it. Major reasons, obviously, being that people had unexpectedly high, unrealistically high, expectations when he came into power. A lot of people did when they voted for him, and life didn't get necessarily better for most Ukrainians, and then maybe even worse. And then at the same time, also he was promising and he was pushing for some kind of a peace plan and some kind of reconciliation on Donbas. That's not happening either. So on two major things, reforms on one hand, and maybe fight against corruption. And then another thing is the war, Donbas situation, there's no progress. And that's why his ratings are falling down. And that's a problem for him. So he's kind of stupefied right now, I think, Zelensky, when COVID arrived, in addition to all of these troubles that he already had beforehand. So that's a problem. And that's why we don't really even see much of him presiding over the effort of fighting COVID. I think it's a big problem for Ukraine. I mean, the prime minister is more or less making some statements and decisions. The parliament meets occasionally, but we need the president to be presiding over this effort. And he's nowhere to be seen. He's making some short videos once in a while, occasionally, but that's not what you need in a time of crisis like this. In many other countries, we actually see political leaders sitting on top of the system, being engaged every day, doing interviews, doing press conferences. That's one of the problems, I think, here in Ukraine, that the communication strategy is not working. The government hasn't thought it out really well. The message of the government is not really reaching the people. That's unfortunately one of the reasons why a lot of rumors and unsubstantiated information and conspiracy theories are floating around, because the government is not reaching out to the people. Unfortunately, this PR kind of link, this PR bridge between the government that we have now and the rest of the population, the rest of the public, is still not being established, really, in my view. And that's why a lot of people are kept in the dark, confused and stuff like that. So I think it's a problem. A lot of internet resources done by NGOs are stepping in to help alleviate the situation. And actually, with COVID, that's another 2014 overall. That time around, the government was taking time, was slow, and was confused with war effort. And then the NGOs and volunteers and civil society stepped in. And with COVID, it's more or less the same. government has wasted a lot of time and not done enough. But then big business came in, small business came in, volunteers, NGOs. Like here in Odessa, for instance, there is a big alliance of businessmen and volunteers who have collected a lot of money and managed to buy on already scarce market, actually, a lot of protection suits for the doctors and lungs ventilators and stuff like that, and disinfectants and stuff like that. So on the positive side, again, that the civil society is showing that it's still vibrant here in this country and trying to step in when the government is lacking some of what they're supposed to be doing. And then some of this political turmoil that we have here recently in Ukraine is not helpful, in my opinion. I mean, months ago, we had quite a serious overhaul of our government. And I don't think it was wise to do it in the middle of epidemics. And also, the healthcare minister in Ukraine, the Minister of Health, we've had 3 since the start of the COVID here in Ukraine. And that's a problem. I mean, you had one and then another, and then Mr. Stepanov, the current minister, actually the former governor of Odessa, he is in for, I think, maybe a week and a half or something like that. But that's not helping in terms of, continuity of what the government is doing, what the ministry is doing. Another final, perhaps, thing that I would like to mention here on the political side is that the system is still very much centralized in Ukraine. And some people might think it's a good thing. I don't. Because, for instance, we've had an effort aimed at decentralization of our system in recent years. And actually, for a good reason, a lot of experts said that probably between 2014 and 2019, one of the best things Ukraine has tried to do was to come up with this decentralization reform. But now the governors are pretty much clueless in many cases. The mayors don't have enough money, don't have enough powers, don't have enough prerogatives. It's still pretty much centralized. Actually, a lot of the budget that the local level, the self-government here, local government had been taken back by Kyiv, and so it's not available here on the local level. So that's a problem. And there is some friction. Quite recently, some of you might have heard about it. There was a big dispute between one mayor of city of Cherkasy on one hand, and then the presidential administration and the government on the other hand. And it's happening. I mean, it's not just in Ukraine. I mean, I'm an American. I follow events in US, and I see what's going on between the White House on one hand, let's say, and a lot of governors and mayors in other cities, big cities on the other. So we're not unique in this position. But frankly, in addition to having the war on our hands and having these epidemics in our hands, I wouldn't like to see the friction between, let's say, the self-government, local government on one hand, and the central government on another. I would rather see us. I would prefer to see us working all together in more or less synchronistic and synergetic way. So I will stop here so that we have enough time for Ivan and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr. Ivan, can I give you the floor now?
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. And I want to thank, first of all, to Macmillan who helps us to have this discussion. And before we actually have a discussion with the other participants, I'll start with presenting my opinion on the COVID-19 and the way Ukraine handles it. And I'll start with a vignette. So imagine, on the last day of April 2020, the capital of Ukraine was paralyzed by an immense traffic jam. It took people up to 2 hours to drive 10 kilometers, 6 miles. And Kyiv is actually notorious, for its congestions. The city is bracketed by Bangkok and Mexico, and it ranks 12th in the global ranking of traffic jams. But I singled out this particular congestion because it occurred on the 38th day of the national quarantine. And the norms of the quarantine, they stipulate that citizens, they may gather only in a group of 2. They cannot access parks or recreation areas. They are advised to stay at home in general. And after all, people actually have neither where nor how to go, for educational and most of the business facilities are closed and public transportation is suspended. But April the 30th was a pleasant day followed by several days off, so people ventured out. They blatantly disregard quarantine measures imposed by the authorities. And many even ignored the mandatory masks and they enjoyed the fresh air. So people are not really, respecting the quarantine here in Ukraine. There are other ways to grasp whether the citizens of Ukraine follow the social isolation requirements. For instance, a leading GSM operator in Ukraine estimated that up to 51% of members of Ivano-Frankivsk, it's a regional capital in Western Ukraine. So 51% stay at home. Only a half. It sounds preposterously little. But in fact, Ivano-Frankivsk is a champion in this regard, because in other regional capitals, as little as 10% comply with the quarantine regulations. And the Prime Minister of Ukraine himself has recently acknowledged that up to 70% of the population go to work regardless of the quarantine. And moreover, social isolation is circumvented not only by the population, but by the political class as well. A couple of days ago, there was a scandal here in Ukraine. It was revealed that a high-end restaurant owned by an MP is operational, despite an explicit governmental decree that prohibits establishments that serve food to function during the COVID-19 outbreak. So we have this cavalier attitude toward the pandemics. And I want to, stress that here in Ukraine, it is only partially irrational. Because as of today, Ukraine, with its 13,000 of COVID-19 cases and only 327 lethal cases. So Ukraine occupies only a distant 36th place in the world rank of COVID-stricken countries. And this seems really a fortunate positioning. I want you to think about this. Because if you consider the dismal deterioration of two Ukrainian neighbors, Russia and Belarus, with whom Ukraine shares the post-Soviet institutional and infrastructural frameworks. And so let's check on Russia. The number of cases in Russia increased by 66% during the last week. So now currently Russia is occupying the 7th place among the nations touched by COVID-19. In Belarus, the number of cases also soared for 43%. And now it's reaching, 17,000. Ukraine, so it seems to be faring quite well. And as a result, when an individual faces choice between, can you hear me?
Ivan, we lost you partly, it seems.
Is it okay?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. It was like a kind of disconnection here. I don't know why. Sorry. So I was talking about an individual facing a choice between, on the one hand, there is a slight likelihood to catch a distant disease. And on the other hand, there is this requirement to sacrifice your economic activities, to skip a pleasant afternoon. So many people, they are eager to take chances. And such a behavior, it is well known to psychologists. They actually discovered that individually, each of us tends, to overestimate our abilities and to underestimate the dangers. And there is a recent poll here in Ukraine on public opinion, which reveals that with regard to COVID-19, 87% of respondents, they believe that the virus poses a threat, a really tangible threat for Ukraine in general, but only 50% suppose that it poses a personal danger. So this is the gap I'm talking about. Still, this careless approach to COVID-19 adopted by Ukraine has an additional level of explanation, and I want to touch it. Because I would argue that the viral hazard is perceived as insignificant due to a constellation of luck and administrative measures. And it is essential, I want you to understand me correctly, that the luck is running out and administrative measures are less and less effective. And Ukraine is still being challenged by COVID. So to put it bluntly, things are likely to get worse. And now I want to elaborate on this idea. I want you to understand me correctly. So why they're getting to get worse? When I said luck, I don't mean there is a goddess of fortune who reserved, a really good hand for Ukraine. Luck, as I understand it here, is a combination of good features that inhibited the spread of disease in Ukraine. Those two features are direction of international migration and the degree of urbanization. Those features, let me start with the first one, with the direction of international migration. We all know that China was the original center of COVID. And people who visited China, they actually carried the disease back to their homelands. However, both Ukrainian tourists and labor migrants, they prefer other destinations. According to official data, there were only 540 Ukrainians in China when crisis began, and only 53 persons in Wuhan, so the center of the disease. And this slight figure diminished the chances that COVID-19 would be brought directly to Ukraine from China. Besides, the second factor, the special, like in space, clustering of Ukrainian urban areas, it initially halted the viral spread. Because although the degree of urbanization in Ukraine reached 70%, and Ukraine equals Italy in this respect, unlike Italy, urban areas here in this country, they are much more dispersed. And moreover, for the moment of being, I checked the statistics. Out of 4 the most afflicted regions in Ukraine, 3, Chernivtsi, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Ternopil, they belong to the least urbanized regions of the country. Once again, the migratory routes, they also were responsible for this observed trend, because these 3 regions I have just mentioned, they have a considerable chunk of population that works in the European Union. And when the COVID-19 engulfed Italy and Spain, these migrants, they returned home. So we can say that SARS-CoV-2 virus penetrated Ukraine, not from the east, but from west. And still, Chernivtsi, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Ternopil, those regions, they're predominantly rural, and migrants in questions, they actually being villagers rather than urbanites, they stayed at home, and the virus, it was effectively contained in those rural remote areas. So my point is, I'm trying to make here that migratory trends and urban clustering, they actually helped, to temporarily halt the spread of the disease, but they cannot eradicate it. And the task to eradicate the disease, it befalls on social institutions and on, administrative measures. Ukraine, as Volodymyr mentioned it was among the first European nations that choose to close the boundaries to limit the internal movement of people. There was also, a quite early suspension of educational and business activities, and all this contributed to lessening of chances, for the disease to spread. So being this early riser, Ukraine, we can say, reaped an additional benefit to relent the disease transmission. So we can say, wow, so far so good. So why should I posit that situation is likely to deteriorate? There are 4 reasons for my pessimism, and I want to share my opinion now. So first reason is that the inhibitive effect of rural areas being touched is no longer active. According to the statistics, the single most afflicted region right now is the city of Kyiv, and it's highly urbanized metropolitan area. So we can say that the virus has broken loose, and now it can feed on 5 million souls as potential hosts. So there are no 5 million infected people right now, but it is a potential breeding ground for the virus. Second, and Volodymyr mentioned this as well, all over the world, there is a fear that quarantine measures, they can be detrimental to national economy. And in Ukraine, many people used to be occupied as private contractors or run a small business. The quarantine suspended their economic activities and made income impossible. According to a poll, 55% of respondents signalized that they have saved enough money for a less than a month-long subsistence. So they don't have enough money to live 2 months. And the poll was taken in early April. And since the quarantine has been imposed, another kind of information, the number of unemployed rose for 148,000, which makes 48% of unemployed people. Moreover, bigger business, they suffer from inactivity, so they lay off employees. And according to some estimations, there are around 1 million people who have already lost their jobs. So what we can see here, the impact upon the national economy is bound to be immense. And this explains why both people tend to ignore the threat and why they, try to keep on working, just to make some money. And also this explains the threat to the national economy. The hasty governmental decision which was mentioned by Volodymyr as well, to terminate quarantine, to lift it a little bit on May 11th. So it was the second problem with faced by Ukraine. The third one is that the course of action adopted under duress by the government, that course I meant that they decided to lift the quarantine, because the quarantine has exacerbated political tensions. And now we have two important cues that there are those tensions. First is the popular mobilization, and second is confrontation between local and national authorities. Both of them were briefly mentioned by Volodymyr as well. And actually, I want you to understand that mass rallies are effectively banned under the quarantine regime. But during the last week, citizens organized several pickets around the presidential office and at the House of Government in the capital. And there were also several protests in many regions. What people want, they demand food markets to be open, they demand industries to go operational. And it is essential that some local authorities, under popular pressure, they decided to terminate quarantine ahead of any governmental decree. The case in study is Cherkasy, 1 million of inhabitants, whose mayor permitted small businesses to reopen 7 days ago. So Cherkasy is fully operational 7 days a week. And this decision it has enraged President Zelensky, the Minister of Interior Avakov, and it also prompted even a lawsuit against this very mayor. He, in response, argues that economic idleness provoked a fiscal crisis in his city, and national authorities, they are unresponsive, they are unhelpful, and for him there is only one possible way to get some money to his budget, is to reopen the economic life in the city. And Cherkasy example, it was followed by Dnipro, this is a regional capital, and several smaller towns. And the fact that after several days of confrontation, the government itself adopted the very same strategy, that is lifting quarantine measures. It suggests the lack of capacity to enforce governmental rulings. And this is the third reason for my pessimism, because during the COVID-19 crisis, Ukraine showed a dismal lack of state capacity. People visited Eastern religious service, the governmental prohibition notwithstanding. People don't wear masks in a flagrant contradiction to quarantine rulings. People returning from abroad ignored the required self-isolation period and simply vanished from their radars. So, given the lack of the state capacity, the decision to lift the quarantine on May 11th resembles me a character from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince, namely a king with no subjects who only issues orders that can be followed, such as commanding the sun to set at sunset. So my point is that, a powerless Leviathan is not the one anyone wants to be in charge when a major public health disaster strikes. There is a fourth reason, just as if to compound the challenge. The healthcare system in Ukraine suffers from what I call infrastructural dysfunctionality. Because, as mentioned by Volodymyr, between August 2019 and March 2020, the Minister of Public Health, it seemed, to be playing a game of musical chairs. There were 4 different people who assumed the office of Minister of Healthcare. 3 of them actually had to deal with COVID-19 crisis. The lack of continuity in the office is not the only issue, because to contain the spread of the disease, a bulk of devoted... Oh, sorry. Is there an issue with me? We need a bulk of devoted personnel. And nowadays, Ukraine is suffering from, a really big problem, because 20% of medical personnel is estimated to be already infected. And there is also the last problem I want to briefly mention. According to some data, Ukraine performs the least of SARS-CoV-2 tests in Europe. And this alone could explain the low rate of diagnosed COVID-19 cases. And this underreporting is only the tip of the iceberg, because without proper testing, effective identification, and consequent isolation of infected people is impossible. So in other words, the whole strategy to fight the pandemics is undermined. So you see 4 reasons why I think that Ukraine is going only to face the real challenge. Not, let's say, it has not yet already done it. The crisis is going to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivan, and thank you, Volodymyr, for these two great presentations. I would like to invite people to ask questions in the Q&A. Let me begin with the first one. Could you tell us how is the debate on surveillance technologies going on in Ukraine? You know, it's a big issue all over Europe, and in Russia, and especially in Moscow, it has been also something important that the municipalities has been trying to implement. So it would be interesting to have your opinion on how all this discussion about, you know, video surveillance and the process of smartization of cities, especially on Chinese equipment, if there are kind of public debates on the kind of privacy issue it's raising, or is that something that is totally on the side? I don't know which of you wants to begin answering.
Ivan, you want to go first?
Yes, please.
Ivan, you want to go first?
Okay, I can start. So actually, Ukraine is not, you know, the tech and high-tech country, and we are not South Korea, we are not China. And the only real attempt by the government to use the smart technologies for surveillance quarantine measures is the application DIA, which translates like action, which, you know, can serve as a passport, which is in your smartphone, but also it tracks your, let's say, position and geolocation, and it can help to ensure that some people stay at home. But it is not mandatory to have it on your smartphone. So that kind of a strategy, that particular edge, as far as I know, is not very broadly used here in Ukraine.
Volodymyr, would you like to add something?
Yes, just briefly. Ivan is right, and only cities actually I've heard about that they suggested this technology should be used, will be used, is Kyiv actually. Outside of Kyiv, haven't heard about it, and definitely not here in Odessa. That being said, there are debates. There are acute, hot debates in terms of does the government entrench over the human rights, or at the expense of human rights here in Ukraine. And here it's not just an abstract issue. This is something that has been a major question in our almost 30 years of existence of the state. The relationship between the civil society on one hand and the government on another. So no one really wants the government to use the COVID epidemics to launch a major assault on, curtailing human rights and stuff like that. But no, actually, unfortunately, on the contrary, I think there's not enough measures aimed at tracing patients, people who are infected, and the people who they have met, and so on. And also, there have been major issues with testing. I mean, of course, in many other countries as well, in much more better developed and affluent countries in the West, has been also an issue with inadequate testing or lack of testing. But here in Ukraine, especially early on, we didn't have much testing. And that's a huge problem because we're basically without a massive testing, at least much more enhanced testing comparing to what we have now here in Ukraine, we wouldn't be able to have any projections or to have any idea about what the trajectory might be for the epidemics. And that's a problem. Actually, right now, the government is talking about first attempts, first stages of antibody testing here. And Odessa actually selected one of two regions where they supposedly plan to do it. But I don't think those tests have arrived to the region yet.
Good, thank you. And we have question about, do you have more information on the rates of congestion of the health system and more on the effect on the economy and on the private sector? Can we identify which sector are affected and how much? And of course, one of the big issues for Ukraine and as for every country in the region is that the more the economy is informal, the more it's difficult to know which sectors are really affected and which sector are in fact surviving in a more informal way. So if you could kind of delve into these two questions, the congestion of the health system and the kind of private sector, impact on private sector.
Well, the health system was frail to start with, even before COVID arrived, so it didn't get better. I mean, it's already experiencing some pressure on it, and hopefully, if we stay within the numbers that we're seeing, we'll be more or less fine. But if, and I share this concern that Ivan has expressed in his presentation, that the numbers might still go up, and at that point of time, unfortunately, Ukraine's healthcare system would not be it would be overwhelmed. I mean, it would not be able to withstand the pressure of the epidemics. So the healthcare system is in dire straits, and it's nothing you can do right now. I mean, there was something to be done about it for years and years prior to 2020, but it wasn't under various governments. That's a big problem. It's a huge problem. I mean, the wealthy Ukrainians, they can go to this upscale, posh clinics here, or the most wealthy go to abroad to have their treatment. Most of us here in Ukraine, of course, we do not have this choice, don't have this option, and therefore we are stuck with the system that we have, which is pretty much a remnant of what we inherited still from Soviet Union, I'm afraid to say. And with economies, entire economies hit, except like everywhere else, except perhaps for the business dealing with food and grocery, because people do go to supermarkets. Actually, the supermarkets are still crowded here in Ukraine, and people do buy stuff, and everything else is hit hardly. Tourism, obviously, transportation, stuff like that, and also the agriculture is in a difficult situation. To add injury to the insult, to make things worse, we also have a drought here in Ukraine. Actually, we had a rain here today in Odessa, but we didn't have one for months before that, or any kind of precipitation for that matter, even during the winter. And that's a problem here in the south of Ukraine and elsewhere. We have a terrible drought, which would be a problem for us in terms of harvest coming forward with harvest. We still have enough grain right now, even exporting record numbers of grain, I think, to the international markets, but that's from my previous harvest. In terms of looking forward, it's going to be a huge problem here.
Ivan, would you like to add something?
Yes. Yeah, actually about the economy, those sectors of economy which are hit the most, those are small contractors, private contractors, and small businesses. Because, if you own a restaurant and now you just it cannot be operational. Or if you have a hairdress shop and now you're out of business for 2 months, actually when you go down the streets and you can see some businesses closed, the the facilities for sale. So people are getting out of business, and these private contractors are hit the most. And also, it must be understood that, everything in economy is interconnected. And as Volodymyr mentioned, yes, agriculture is also suffering, not only due to the drought, but also because restaurants are not working properly, so nobody buys the food from the farmers. So it is rotting somewhere, and it cannot arrive in time because, half of the transportation is suspended. So many, let's say, sectors are really suffering right now. And that is why, as I mentioned, there is surplus of 1 million people who lost their jobs. So it's a dismal situation. And as regarding the healthcare system, don't forget that there is a medical reform going right now, and there is a battle around this reform because actually there are some plans, to curtail it because there is, let's say, a conservative part of the society and the political class who says that, the reform is bad, so we should just close it. So the system has no continuity even in this regard.
Great, thank you so much. I see Peter Rolberg has raised a hand. Matt, can we unmute Peter so he can ask
Thank you
question?
so much, Marlene. Thank you so much for organizing this event. I think it's a great event, and I think especially because of Volodymyr's and Ivan's candor in describing the situation. I wanted to ask you about the role of the media in Ukraine in handling the reality of this experience. I follow the Russian media, and I can see that there's a lot of anger and frustration and eruptions of anger going on in Russia, but the media don't really reflect that. The official media really try to present things as if everything is in order, and the president is shown giving very good statements, by the way. So this is not, on him, but clearly there's a big disparity between the reality on the ground as reported by unofficial media and some newspapers and what is presented in on official TV. Is there such a disparity also in Ukrainian media? And the other question, if I may, is about the mythology that surrounds this virus. And again, I look at the way people in Western Europe react to that, and here, and also in Russia. And there's an entire mythology about the origins, the real origins of that, as opposed to the officially reported ones. Home remedies that might help, and things like that. Is that also part of the experience in Ukraine? Thank you.
Right.
Well, we can start with the second question you asked, because actually it's in human psyche to look for conspiracies, like for the bad guys, and for remedies. And yes, there are some, let's say, recipes how to cook, a lotion for your hand that will save you of virus. Some, charlatans who try to sell you, and there are actually in the media reports on those charlatans who take, say, iodium sulfate and then sell it as like the best possible solution to COVID challenge. So it happens here in Ukraine as well. I mean, there are some situations when people are unsure whether they can believe official information, and they go to look for some unofficial solutions. The media, I want to ponder over it a little bit longer. Actually, here in Ukraine, I would say that the media are more, let's say, overt in their covering the situation and in the reporting on it. For instance, there is recently a kind of a scandal because it was revealed by the media that people who are coming back from abroad, and officially the borders are closed, so people cannot, cross it on air. They cannot take, let's say, go on foot. So the only way for people to cross borders to come back to Ukraine for Ukrainian citizens is actually to take buses. And there is like a kind of not illegal smuggling, but some private contractors, they organize those busing of people, of Ukrainians who are coming back through the national boundary, and they charge money for this. So this is like something which is going on here.
Right.
Volodymyr, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just briefly, I think Ivan done a good job on both issues. On conspiracy theories and rumors, we have plenty of that. I mean, actually, there are many parallels from what you see in US, here in Ukraine. For instance, here in Ukraine also, there is a big anti-vaxxer movement. Probably not as big as in some corners in US, but it's still visible here. It's very much widespread. And that gives me, pause, and scares me a little bit, because if we are lucky enough and we at some point would have a vaccine that would be proven to be working and efficient and so on, would we have enough people who would be willing to vaccinate themselves? Because if we don't, that would mean that you would have carriers around me. Even if I take the vaccine, I mean, I'm safe, but that would be a problem for the country. So there are rumors, there are conspiracy theories here elsewhere, of course. There is a lot of distrust for the government. What the government is saying is our old Soviet/post-Soviet tradition. A lot of people are, maybe they kind of lie. They're probably lying. I mean, they never tell us truth. And a lot of mentality is still here. Surprisingly, to some extent, because the government that we have right now has been elected in a landslide, but yet still there is no trust. Even from a lot of those people who elected the current president and the parliament in the first place, but still they don't trust the government. So there is this. With media, I don't see a lot of disconnect. So there's a lot of investigative materials. There's a lot of coverage on all sides of it. Some praising where it's right, what the government is doing. Some are critical. Journalists are pretty free in terms of expressing their opinions. So I see some of my journalist friends pretty alarmist and pro-lockdown mode, and some are actually saying, no, let's end the lockdown, let's save economy. So there's discussion brewing on social media and the press, and that's pretty vibrant. It's not stifled.
Great. Thank you. We have another question on the government measure regarding churches and assistance to religious services. And also a second question links to that, which is it seems that some monasteries of the Moscow Patriarchate have been considered as infection cluster by Kiev. So the point is that, do we see any kind of political and religious tensions emerging between Ukraine and the Moscow Patriarchate around playing on the pandemics, how that links to the geopolitical tension around the creation of the autonomous Orthodox Ukrainian Church? So two questions, the government measure regarding assistance to religious services and the kind of religious geopolitical fight between Ukraine and Moscow.
Okay.
Shall I start?
Okay, go ahead, Ivan. Go ahead. Ivan, go ahead.
So, to begin with, about the Moscow Patriarchate here in Kiev, actually it is true. Several monasteries are the breeding ground of the disease. It is officially right now. And the reasons, that is something which is to be speculated about. So how it came to this result. There is no, let's say, attempt by the Moscow to play this card yet. Maybe they have too much on their own plate. Maybe they are not unsure how to use it. But the plain fact is that, yes, Moscow Patriarchate is hit by the disease. And now to another question regarding the churches and access to churches. Actually, it was a problem because 2 weeks ago, yes, am I correct? Am I lost in time? 2 weeks ago, it was an Eastern here, the Orthodox Eastern. And there was a kind of scandal when government issued that no masses should be taken and allowed. So people, should stay outside the churches, and the bishop or whoever who gives a sermon, he is alone in the church. But in many churches belonging to the Moscow Patriarchate, actually people penetrated the cordon sanitaire. Sometimes they actually pushed through policemen, and there were promises to prosecute those people. And actually, I don't remember the numbers correctly, but it was something like dozens of people were, arrested, or at least detained for further prosecution for those infractions.
Yeah, just briefly, maybe, if I may. Yes, I would like to say that the government of Ukraine has been actually very careful treading that way, not to appear as violating the rights or stifling the rights or limiting the rights of the churchgoers. This is a delicate issue here. The government in Kiev was quite well aware. If you sent police squads, close down by force the churches and prevent people from coming to churches, that would be a scandal. That would be shown on the media. That would be shown on TV, and Ukraine would appear with this reputation of the government not allowing people to execute, to basically to have their rights to go to church and stuff like that. So it was a very careful and mild reaction there on the government's part. And I think it worked out fine because a lot of people actually, after all, stayed home. According to the numbers that we've seen over Easter, there was an unusually low number of people who actually turned out and went to the churches.
Great. I would like to ask also a question regarding the relationship to Belarus. And I was wondering how in Ukraine, the fact that Lukashenko has been downplaying and even denying the importance of the pandemics, how is that discussed in Ukraine and how is that impacting on the relationship with Belarus? And then after, because we will have only a few minutes to conclude, if you could, each of you very briefly kind of give us your overview of what will be the issues for the Zelensky government in the forthcoming months, and that may be something beyond the pandemics itself, but what you think are the big things that the Zelensky government has on its plate for the forthcoming months.
Yeah, we can have another hour on that. But
yes.
On Belarus, I don't think that the disparity of approaches between Ukrainian and Belarusian leaders would lead to some confrontation or deterioration of relationship between two countries. But personally, I think, and many Ukrainians, I think, agree that Lukashenko has been responsible and he's dealing with the crisis and the epidemics. And I, for one, praise our government at least for taking it in a serious way. Maybe not doing enough, maybe doing a little bit too late and a little too late, but at the same time still seeing it as a serious threat and trying to deal with it as such. On Zelensky's perspectives, I think that there will be ratings coming down because, after all, he's the one who is governing, and he's responsible for what's happening. And be it epidemics if it grows, or be it economy which is in the dire straits right now, that will be at his seen as his fault, and he's in a difficult situation. I don't envy him. I mean, and I said before that I think there were unrealistically high expectations of him that he could deliver, but the people might, in fact, see more of this incompetence and lack of professionalism on his part, of his government. There might be more changes in the government in the coming months. We'll see about that. And not to mention, of course, that many other issues are not resolved, including Donbas and Crimea. And that is also, of course, on our minds.
Ivan?
I'll start with Zelensky and like the broader question. Actually, I have just opened a recent poll on public opinion to check how the citizens, let's say, what do they think about the ways that government and the president tackle the issue. And according to this poll, 39% of citizens think that Zelensky is working effectively, whereas only 20% believe that the government does something correctly. And it shows, you know, the problem. Everything here in Ukraine, people, they don't understand which branch of power does what. They think that it is the president who tries to fight, you know, corruption, who tries to fight the viral infection, not the government. So the result of the COVID, and once again, I'm very pessimistic because I believe that the crisis is just coming to Ukraine. The result will have direct impact on the way people perceive the landscape. And I actually think that let's say the tempest is just gathering on his head. So he will reap some bad benefits, some outcomes. Macmillan, we can hear you?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. Can you see me? Yeah. So I think we don't have any more questions. It's already 1 p.m. here in the US. So I wanted to thank all our participants and our two speakers from Ukraine who have been able to give us this really interesting, fascinating overview of how things are going on in Ukraine. And I invite everybody to stay in tune with our next events. We will have two next week, one on Monday, May 11th on Tajikistan with 4 speakers looking at the situation about the pandemics there. And on May 13, we will have an event on Putin constitutional reforms and grassroots mobilization in Russia. So not directly on the pandemics, because it's also important to remember that there are other things happening outside the pandemic. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you Volodymyr and Ivan for your contribution today. I wish everybody to stay safe. Yes, stay all safe at home. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Bye.
Ciao.